Welcome to Interesting Times. I'm Joe Streckert. This is an independent, listener-supported podcast. To support the show, go to interestingtimespodcast.com. Hello, everyone. Today's episode is something a little different. I interviewed a musician. Cecilia Otto, or Cece Otto, as she is also known. She recreates American pop songs from the late 1800s and early 1900s. And recently, she had a really kind of unusual and ambitious history project. She went on a road trip on the remains of the Lincoln Highway. The Lincoln Highway was a pre-interstate highway auto trail that went from New York to San Francisco, and she traveled the remains of it and also sang songs about the Lincoln Highway while on her tour, which is awesome. How could I not talk to her? I really dig things like that. You know, I like to read about history and talk about history and, write about history, and I do live events and podcasts and all that. But I cannot help but admire people who go the extra mile by, say, dressing up as a pirate, or, learning old-timey blacksmith skills, or going on road trips on the remains of an old highway and singing songs about what used to be there. This is a total cliche, and I'm sort of sorry for saying it, but hey, that makes history come alive. No, for real, that makes history come alive. That is awesome. So, we have a talk with Cecilia, or Cece. You will hear some of the music that she performs, and enjoy. Hello, Cece.
Hello, Joe. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Cool. So I thought we would start things off by you summing up to people what it is you do. If somebody were to approach you and ask you for the 30-second elevator pitch of your whole project, what is that?
I would tell them that I share America's history through song. That's my main focus. And so what I do is I do programs, concert programs, are themed around vintage music in vintage attire. And then I usually also introduce the pieces in kind of a vaudevillian style so that people have kind of a reference point for the music. So it's not just thrown at them and they have to kind of figure out what I'm singing about and why this is important.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And what time periods are you focusing on?
I focus on roughly the 1890s to anything prior to World War II. So I kind of cut it off at about 1935, 1938.
All right. Excellent. And so when we're talking about period attire, we're not talking about, say, Continental Army jackets or, that type of thing. What do you look like when you're doing these shows?
Good point. When I do these shows, it's basically post-corset, because that's pretty hard to sing in, as you can imagine.
I've never worn a corset, but I imagine so.
Post-corset, but pre-flapper. So the gowns are, go still down to the ankles, but again, there's no corset, so they tend to have, the dresses of 100 years ago would have kind of a general, blank kind of monotone color and it was usually sleeveless, and then they would invest in, lace and embroidered, over gowns, and you would put those over the dress, and you change those out so that it's changing your look without spending a lot of money.
Ah,
yeah,
that's clever.
It is. Nobody thought, but yeah, that's kind of how you do that look from the period, is to find a nice slip or a nice kind of sleeveless dress, and then you put something kind of fancy over it.
Okay, so you are replicating both the look and sound.
Yes, from the makeup to the shoes to the gestures, everything is pretty much replicated for the time period.
Okay, excellent. Mm-hmm. And how did you get into this?
Wow, that's been a journey unto itself. I am a classically trained singer and composer, and my background and focus originally was in opera and in operetta music, so think Gilbert and Sullivan or, Victor Herbert pieces or that kind of thing. And, when the economy kind of hit in the late 2008, 2009, artists took a hit too, right? Everyone took a hit. And I was trying to think of ways to still kind of do something that wasn't opera, because there just weren't people hiring. And so I thought about all the things that I love to do. And it came down to, I love to sing, I love to travel, I love to write music, and I love to write words. And so the words singing travelogue popped into my head, and I thought, that's a really cool concept. What does that mean? You know, it was just kind of, what does that mean? And I had to sit with it for a while. And then I got kind of an aha moment, and I thought back to a book that I was given by a friend of mine called The Songlines by Bruce Chatwin. And in that book, this British travel writer follows Australia's Aborigines on walkabout and tries to figure out what they do, and they actually sing their ancestors back into existence. And I thought that was an amazing idea, and I kind of wanted to bring an American version to that here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's talk about the travelogue. You went on a road trip.
I did. Almost 6-month road trip.
A musical road trip.
Yes.
Okay, so what did that entail?
So I had this singing travelogue idea in my head, and I was like, how do I do this in America? And I thought, there's so much history in the roads in this country. Mm-hmm. There's so much of our culture is tied up in the love affair of the automobile, the love affair of, going across the country when pioneers, went across, and once they got west of the Mississippi, who knew what would happen, and that kind of thing.
You'd die of dysentery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Usually that was the case. So I started looking at the roads, the map system of this country, and of course interstates are just boring. Horribly, horribly boring. Like, no one wants to see anyone do a singing travelogue near the beef jerky at a truck stop. It just is not a good idea. Although, there might be a few out there, but, I think that wasn't a good idea. So I found the national highway system and the auto trail system that we had at the turn of the century, which was honestly really fascinating because roads didn't have numbers like they do now. They had names. They had stories behind them, and they were based off of pioneer trails, Civil War trails, Revolutionary War trails, anything you could think of, and they incorporated that history into those roads and into what was actually called the Good Roads movement, because all of these horseless carriagers were appearing, and nobody could travel anywhere with them because the roads were still pretty bad. They were in really bad shape, lots of mud. You'd have paved roads probably in kind of immediate towns, but for people to get from one town to another was quite arduous at points. So there were a lot of, no surprise, automotive dealers, automotive makers of tires, and various other things that kind of banded together and wanted to make these roads better so not only people could get from point A to point B, but they could also sell a few things on the side, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I saw all the history in these roads, and I was looking at all of the different names and saw the Lincoln Highway, and it really stood out to me, not only because, it was transcontinental. It went from New York to San Francisco, but it also pretty much mirrored the first transcontinental railroad on a number of levels. So you're going through some really interesting scenery. Mm-hmm. And, it was known, there were a few songs about it, but it wasn't known like Route 66 or the Blues Highway, which is Route 61 that, Dylan sings about, and a couple other jazz musicians. So I thought, this is where I want to take this journey. And I also saw in an interesting coincidence that it was turning 100 in 2013. So I thought, what a great way to kind of celebrate, this road and celebrate America by giving kind of vintage style concerts, the songs they would have heard 100 years ago while they were driving and taking their own road trips across the country. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how long would have it taken for somebody to go from New York to San Francisco on this thing? What was the speed limit like? What were the road conditions like?
It's really interesting because, so many people, this was so foreign to them that, first off, let's also make the reference point that there were not speedometers. Speedometers were not required in cars until, I think, the 20s or the 30s. Same with headlights. They were options that people could have. So each car was a little bit more kind of makeshift, and a lot of people would only drive a day for that reason.
Yeah.
So these travel guides that actually came out. There's not just, there's multiple ones of the different auto trail routes, but there's actually ones of the Lincoln Highway from 1915, 1916. They would publish new ones as new hotels and diners, and they would also publish the gas prices, the mileage, the speeds through these towns, because sometimes the signs weren't posted. Your typical mileage was anywhere from about 5 to 15 miles an hour. And to get across the country, they said it was roughly 30 to 60 days, depending on your car.
Wow.
Which normally, of course, would have taken weeks by train, so they were touting this as, the fastest way to get across the country. But they noted in these travel guides to be very prepared, that once you got west of Omaha or Cheyenne, depending on the year of publication for the Lincoln Highway, you had to bring water. You had to bring 10 pounds of potatoes with you. You had to bring rations, and, some of the fun comments that I actually sang about on the tour were, don't drink alkali water, serious cramps result. Don't wear new shoes, because so many people got dressed up because it was such a big status symbol and such a big deal, to drive in an automobile, which, of course, is so different now. No one has to pack 10 pounds of potatoes. No one dresses up when they're driving in a car for long distances.
Right.
Yeah. It's fascinating. The song I was talking about, too, was kind of interesting. A composer who was actually writing some orchestral suites about the Lincoln Highway. He did movements for different regions. He saw what I was about to do when I did this big road trip, and he approached me and said, I'm really interested in writing a couple of songs for your tour. And so he and I spoke for a few hours on the phone in a couple different conversations and picked over these old 1915, 1916 travel guides and found some really interesting kind of advice and nuggets and all the flowery poetry that came with the 19 teens. And he put it together in this kind of faux poetry style. So the first song was about the do's and don'ts, what to do, what not to do. And then the second one was about, what would you see along the way? What were the signs? What were the different, mentions in the travel guidebook? Like, for example, in Yosepa, Utah, there was a Hawaiian settlement that came over. Yeah, because, of course, there were Mormons with Brigham Young that went to Hawaii and they wanted to bring people back. So they brought them back and created a Hawaiian settlement there. And it was like the only settlement for miles and miles to get water and to do whatever else. And it notes in the caption, native dances are sometimes held, that kind of thing. And of course now Yosepa is actually a ghost town. There's a cemetery there, and they have kind of annual events for the Hawaiian descendants that live either in Utah, or people come back from Hawaii and will celebrate kind of that history there. But that's kind of an interesting, I never would have thought, factoid about the route.
Right. So the songs that you're performing were written about the Lincoln Highway, and what's an example of one?
Oh, so there's a great old piece by Al Jolson that was written in the 1920s, and it was called Golden Gate, and it was about how people were fed up with the rain and snow, and he wanted to go someplace to ease his weary heart. And so where did you go? You went to California, and you drove through the Golden Gate, and a little sun-kissed blonde is smiling his way just beyond the Lincoln Highway. And so there were little kind of mentions and rhymes about it in that. A famous musical also as well, it's called Babes in Arms. And Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland were in this musical, and it's actually about these kids who have parents who are out of work vaudeville performers, and they're trying to raise money for summer stock, more or less.
So do you think we could maybe cut and allow listeners to listen to you performing one of those songs?
Yeah!
All right, what are they going to listen to?
What are they going to listen to? They're going to listen to God's Country. That's the piece from Babes in Arms. It's the finale of Act 4.
Going my way, east to west on the Lincoln Highway. Hi there, Yankee, get up in the great big thanky. You're in God's country, where grass is greener, timber taller, mountains bigger, and trouble smaller.
this music do people consume? That what you said was from a musical, but most of it would have been live performances.
Live performances, and those performances would have been saloons, dance halls, opera houses. There were country club programs. That's one facet of this tour that I also did because I wanted to bring a community focus to the tour. Mm-hmm. So I actually contacted historical societies and archives across all 14 states along the route and told them what I was doing. And I said, could you please send me programs, if you have any concert programs from 1913 to 1935, to see kind of what they performed 100 years ago. And the results were really fascinating because there were songs that you wouldn't think that you would hear, but you would hear. One example in the classical music world, there's kind of that thought process that you're going to hear the same stuff no matter what. Like everybody who listens to Mozart now, they were listening to the same stuff of Mozart 100 years ago. And it's not the case. For example, I found these old programs of Lily Lehman. She was a very prominent mezzo-contralto that performed in Carnegie Hall in Pittsburgh because, of course, Andrew Carnegie had Carnegie Halls all over the place at that point. And she did excerpts from Carmen, which, of course, everyone knows. But she did some Haydn canzonettas, believe it or not. Haydn actually wrote songs in English because he had people who were friends in London at the time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there was a song called The Wanderer that was very interesting for 200 years prior. It sounds like an old radio play when you hear it. You close your eyes and there's this, think of those train track diminished chords that you're hearing, da-da-da-da, someone's tied to the train tracks and they're asking for help. It's all of that there, but it was actually there 200 years ago when it would have been very unconventional for the time. But people really responded to it, obviously, in the 20s as the radio movement is just kind of getting its legs, as people are starting to have that money to buy radios and hear those radio dramas. So it was interesting. It was an interesting choice from a classical music selection.
Okay. A lot of the music that was also associated with the highway, was that ever, we're talking about sort of like popular music, obviously. Was that ever, say, like commercial? Is this something that like a state or a business or whatnot would commission to promote themselves? How is this written and disseminated?
I think what's interesting about that period is, and there were a couple of songs like this that I featured on the tour that were actually kind of grassroots people demanding the music be written for it. There's one great story that I tell about this song called Out Where the West Begins. And back in 1915, there were governors arguing in several states about where the West began. And they argued, of course, via newspaper, because telegraph, there's just no point after a certain point. So they would have their opinions known of where did the West begin. Was it, Montana? Was it Nebraska? Was it Colorado? Was it Wyoming? And this Denver Post columnist of the time, his name was Arthur Chapman, he published a poem about where he thought the West began on the very front page of the Denver Post. And again, this is along the Lincoln Highway at that point. And people loved the poem. People responded to this poem. They recited this poem. It spread through newspaper like wildfire, and it became the most recited poem for the late teens.
It went viral.
It went viral for 100 years ago, exactly. Yeah. And people loved the poem so much, there was a demand to have it set to music because they wanted to dance and sing to it.
Huh.
Yeah.
Is that something you've performed?
Yes, I have.
Can we cut to that?
Yes, we can.
All right.
Stronger, out where the smile dwells a little longer, that's where the West begins. Out where the sun shines a little brighter, where snows that fall are a trifle wider, where the bonds of home are a wee bit tighter, that's where the West begins.
So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about how the people actually controlled the music a little bit more in ways that, we just don't even fathom. Who knew a poem on a newspaper could go viral, as you said, and then have it be demanded to be put to music so people could sing and dance to it.
Right, that is extraordinarily cool. And how is something else that I want to ask you about was how is this music reproduced, and how is it put into like the hands of the performers?
Oh, good question. So Tin Pan Alley and sheet music, especially in the 19-teens, was a massive industry. There were 6 billion pieces of music sold between 1910 and 1920 in this country alone. I mean, it was a massive industry. It was how people passed the time because, again, silent films were there, but that cost money. The way people entertained themselves was through music. So these songs were kind of the go-to, and a lot of places had not only, depending on the size of the town, you would either have, obviously a piano store or a musical store, but you may also have a sheet music store, depending on where you went.
Okay.
And
you have some vintage sheet music here today.
I do, actually, yes. And you can see that, it's pretty big.
Yeah, so describing this, this is larger than you'd think it would be. I'm seeing these 2 bits of sheet music, and they are bigger than an old copy of Life magazine, if that's any reference point for people. It's not as big as a legal pad, but it's still huge. Yeah. So where would you have bought this, and how would you have previewed it, and how is it reproduced, and what was the industry behind these things?
So you would have bought these either, again, at music stores or sheet music stores. They were, of course, printed by various publishers, usually in New York or Chicago. And they would do kind of a general hand drawing, and then they would get pressed and printed. Same with the music as well, because, of course, I wish, have your listeners just Google, old sheet music, but you can see the detail on these prints is just amazing, and they all kind of look like this. They're, that sheet music had to tell a story on the cover so people would buy it. And one way people would, of course you look at this cover and you're like, what does this song sound like? Right. How do you know what this is going to sound like? Well, they had people that were sheet music girls or boys, and they were trained to sight read the sheet music and sing along with what was there. So if someone came in, they would give you a quarter, and they would play that sheet music so you could hear the song, and if you liked the song, they kept the quarter and you would take the music with them. If you didn't like the music, it was just a dime for their time to play through that. But that was kind of how people heard this stuff because, of course, there were cylinder recordings, there were, old Victrolas and things, but it was still pretty expensive to buy those types of players, so you had to have someone actually play it for you so you could hear it.
Right. And a lot of those early recordings probably didn't give you a really true idea of what it sounded like either.
Very true. It's interesting to note, especially with the recording technology of the time, a lot of these singers, especially if they were kind of classically trained, which a lot of them were, to sing with the ranges of this stuff, they would actually sing to a back wall. They'd sing to a wall, and then the sound would bounce and hit the microphone, because the microphones just did not have good technology of the time, which is why they always had that kind of airy, kind of faraway quality. It was because that was the best way they could capture it for the time.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening to the Lincoln Highway? I mean, nowadays when people are planning their cross-country trips, you get on an airplane or interstate highway system. Is it still around? You went on a road trip. Like, what is there today? What happened and what is there today?
What happened was a lot of people, as these cars started doing these road trips at the turn of the century, they saw the traffic that came through, and that, of course, brought money to their town and commerce to their towns. But there was not really decent ways to market still. We didn't have the highway signs that we had today. People would kind of paint phone poles with these logos, and that would sort of market, but there were also just kind of markers that were just stuck in the ground for people to follow, or you were asking so-and-so at this farm, which way does it go now, that kind of thing. That was your GPS for 100 years ago, was actually people kind of telling you stuff. And what ended up happening was neighboring towns got very jealous. So in order to cash in on some of this in the middle of the night, because, again, people were not driving at night, they would steal these markers and move them to have it go through their town.
Okay.
This was very common along not only the Lincoln Highway, but some of these other roads like the Dixie Highway as well.
So to get some of that, like, sweet travel revenue.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
So the government was pretty annoyed by this and decided in the 1920s that all of these named auto trails on the National Auto Trail System needed to be numbered. And so when they did that, unlike Route 66, where it's almost a number all the way through, the Lincoln Highway, because it was over 3,000, it was 3,300 miles roughly, it was broken up into multiple numbers. And that's ultimately what caused the demise of the highway. You know, the Boy Scouts in 1928 actually did a nationwide tour where they plotted these concrete markers with this bronze bust head of Lincoln. It had the little logo and the arrow, so anybody who still knew the name of the road could follow it. But of course, eventually people didn't know what that meant. They would get plowed over. I mean, to this day, people still find them buried in, because it just falls and then the dirt falls over it, or some people stole it for the bronze head and then find it in a garage.
Thinking like you're just out there in the field and you find like a bronze Abe Lincoln head.
It's mostly along like some of the old county roads and frontage roads that you'll find this stuff, but there's people that I've talked to as I went across the route where you'll have, these markers are about 3 to 4 feet high. And the bust head, or the little marker head with his little flat little bronze thing on, because it looks like a penny, but it's just really big.
Right.
That's about this big, and I've seen in museums.
This is great radio. How
big is
that?
it? Sorry.
It's okay.
I would say it's about 18 inches, roughly, for an original marker. No.
18 inches.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So this 18-inch top of these markers out of 3 to 4 feet has resurfaced in a lot of places where people just kind of stole the top of it, and then it got stored away in an attic or a garage, and people are going through stuff and they're like, what is this? Because nobody remembers. And all of a sudden, Lincoln Highway museums, and there's actually a National Lincoln Highway Association. We're like, oh, that needs to be in a museum, and here's why, and they have to explain it. Yeah. So today, because this numbering system broke up the highway, it makes it difficult. But with the modern Lincoln Highway Association that was born in the 90s, they took over 10 years to structure a Google map that you can literally follow turn by turn. If you go to their website, and you can see all the different alignments that occurred over time, you can see the different landmarks that are there, and about 85% of the route is actually still fairly drivable. There's some sections on private land. There's actually some sections that are now part of the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, which is a huge military base through the desert. And so those are some harder detours that you kind of have to take around, but a lot of it is still accessible and still in fairly good condition. You can see actually brick stretches. There's actually a yellow brick stretch in Pennsylvania you can drive on. There's some red brick stretches that go for, I think the one in Nebraska is about 2 miles, and it's maintained extremely well.
Very cool. But the highway signs don't say the Lincoln Highway or like this exit for the Lincoln Highway. It's labeled with whatever modern highway name or number it might have.
Unfortunately, in a lot of places it is. There are some movements depending on the state that there are actually some, scenic highway routes in Ohio, in Iowa, in Illinois. Of course, in the land of Lincoln, Illinois, it's very clearly marked. It would be kind of a disservice to the state if they didn't do that. There's some sections in Nevada and Nebraska that are also marked as well, but there are also part of the state, other states that aren't marked. And yes, you're kind of relying on paper maps, Google Maps. Again, don't use GPS because it's going to steer you towards the freeway unless you turn that off. But, most of the time I was relying on paper or my eyes, or actually the architecture of the road when I was going. I kind of knew towards the end of it if I was on or off that highway because of how it looked. And another secret for your listeners too is to look for the telephone poles.
Oh.
It's an interesting thought, right? Because as the road was getting laid, the telephone system was also getting put in at the same time, so they had to have access to those cables and wires to fix them. So in a lot of states, especially kind of in the Midwestern states, either look for the railroad to be on your left or your right, or look for those telephone poles, or both.
Okay.
And that will give you a really good idea of where you're at.
Cool. So what are you doing now?
What am I doing now? Well, after I finished the tour, I took some time and then I published a book about my travels, kind of talking about this. A lot of people wanted to find out what it was like to do something like this. And then I recorded some favorite songs and also some new songs I wrote about the route. And what I'm also working on right now is actually a World War I project. I saw there were more songs written about that war than any other war in history. And, I think a lot of people use the sheet music both in America and I think abroad to kind of tout their propaganda. Again, if it wasn't the newspaper and people were using music as their entertainment, it was a way for people to be educated and informed about the war. So they would buy these songs to learn about what was happening. And there's just some amazingly just great stuff. And I thought that those songs and stories needed to be heard. And I feel like that period of history is very overlooked in America just because we weren't involved for very long. But there's still a lot of great stories to be told. So I am, I launched a crowdfunding campaign to take pre-orders for this album. It's a little bit trickier to produce an album of this type. Because as people may or may not remember, the songs were shorter then because of the technology at the time. So I almost have to double my album length to make a decent album by today's standards.
So how long could a song be with the technology of that time?
Typical technology with either Edison cylinders or some of the early wax records was generally 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay.
So a song for today is roughly about, they make the joke that why are pop music songs always under 4 minutes, but it seems the magic number for ears and listening is about 3 minutes and 50 seconds. And it's kind of interesting to note that, 50 seconds is not a lot when you think about it, but in regards to building a full album, that can make a huge difference in regards to how people interpret and, disseminate the music.
Okay. Very cool. And the crowdfunding campaign was that Kickstarter, Indiegogo, GoFundMe. Let's send people there.
I'm doing it on Indiegogo.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
And what should they search for?
Songs of WW1.
All right.
And they'll find me there.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And the name of your book and album?
The name of my book and album is An American Songline, a musical journey along the Lincoln Highway.
All right.
Yep, both the album and CD have the same title.
All right. Excellent. Cool. So, Cece, thank you very much for talking with me today.
Thank you again, Joe, for having me. This has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
We have links to all of Cecilia's stuff, her site, her book, her album, her crowdfunding campaign, over at interestingtimespodcast.com. Thank you very much for listening. Talk to you next week. Bye.
The Lincoln Way, so selected, if done wisely, will become great. I offer a few suggestions and also a list of supplies to carry. 2 extra tire casings, 4 extra inner tubes, 2 sets tire chains, 6 extra cross chains, 8 feet high tension cable, 8 feet low tension cable, 1 set lamp bulbs, 1 Spartan horn, 1 5-gallon milk can for water west of Cheyenne, 1 axe, 1 shovel,